He was a poor father whom no one had taken seriously for a long time. When he dragged home a huge rusty safe, everyone laughed at him. Neighbors, friends, even his own family. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you're watching this video from. The day had begun the same as all the others for John Mercer, a man who had long ago learned to measure time, not by calendars, but by the steady rhythm of survival. His small house sat at the far end of the dusty road that wound past the edge of the town and into the valley. It leaned slightly to one side, as though the years and the wind had pressed against it too long, and its roof carried the weary sag of age. Behind it, the earth was hard and cracked, and what little grew there did so by sheer stubbornness, like the man himself. Inside that house, every object told a story of repair. A chair mended with wire, a table braced by an old plank, a door whose handle had been replaced 3 times. There was nothing new, but everything still served. John rose before dawn, as he always did. The mornings were his, the only hours that felt clean and quiet before the noise of the world returned. He brewed a cup of coffee, thin and bitter, and drank it in silence while looking out the window at the faint light creeping over the hills. The world outside was pale and colorless, the horizon hazed with dust. He glanced at the small bedroom door across from him, where his daughter Ellie still slept. She was only 9, but already carried the calm understanding of a child who has seen her father's hands cracked from work and heard coins clink too softly in his pockets. When the sun finally broke the ridge, John took his gloves and left for the junkyard where he worked on and off. It wasn't much of a job sorting scrap, salvaging what could still be sold, hauling the rest to be melted down, but it kept food on their table and shoes on Ellie's feet. He had no complaints. Life had taught him that you could either curse what you lacked or find something to hold on to in the ruins. For John, that something had always been his work, his daughter, and the quiet faith that no hardship lasted forever. The junkyard stretched like a metal graveyard, a sprawl of twisted frames, engines, and forgotten machines. He moved among them easily, his eyes trained to notice things others ignored. Rust didn't scare him. It was just age written on iron. But that morning, something caught his attention. Near the far end of the yard, half buried in soil and old tires, stood a great iron-shaped square, solid and unlike anything else around it. The surface was flaked with rust, so thick it looked like bark on a dead tree. But beneath it he could still see the faint outlines of hinges and a round dial long seized in place. It was a safe. He crouched beside it, brushing away dirt with his hands. The thing was enormous, as tall as his chest and wide enough that 2 men would struggle to move it. The hinges had fused into lumps of corrosion, and the metal door bore the faint ghost of some engraving that time had erased. He ran his hand over it, feeling the pitted surface beneath his calloused fingers. There was something about it, something he couldn't quite explain. The other workers passed by without interest. To them, it was nothing but junk too heavy to sell and too stubborn to break apart. One of them laughed when he saw John kneeling there. "Leave it, Mercer," he said. "Ain't nothing in there but air and disappointment." John didn't answer. He just nodded absently, his eyes fixed on the safe as though it had whispered something to him. When the foreman shouted for everyone to clear up, he made his decision. He asked what the boss wanted for it. The man looked at him as if he were joking. "That thing? You can have it. Just haul it off my yard and I'll call it even." That night, long after the others had gone home, John stayed behind with a borrowed handcart. The safe was so heavy he thought it might split the earth before it moved. But inch by inch, foot by foot, he wrestled it out of the dirt. His back screamed in protest, his palms blistered, but he didn't stop. By the time he reached the road, the moon had risen, a thin pale coin in the sky, and its light glinted faintly off the iron's rough surface. It took him hours to drag it home. The road was long, uneven, and silent except for the squeal of the cart's wheels. In the distance, porch lights flickered on as curious eyes followed him. Someone laughed, another shouted something he didn't catch, and before long, the whispering began. The man who brought home a broken safe, the fool who thought treasure lay buried in rust. By the time he reached his yard, sweat had soaked his shirt and his hands were raw, but he didn't care. He left the safe beneath the lean-to beside his house and stood back, breathing hard, his eyes shining in the lamplight. Ellie opened the door and came out barefoot, rubbing her eyes. "Daddy?" she asked softly, staring at the hulking thing beside him. "What is it?" John smiled faintly. "Something old," he said. "Something forgotten." She frowned, confused, but said nothing more. He could see the worry in her eyes, though, the same quiet concern her mother once had whenever he took on a burden that seemed too heavy. He told her to go back inside, that it was late, and when the door closed behind her, he stood alone in the night with the safe. The air was still. The moon cast a dull glow over the metal, and he thought for a moment he saw it shimmer, as though the rust shifted slightly under the light. He brushed the surface again and noticed faint letters scratched across the top corner, barely legible. H1, Helios Project. The words meant nothing to him, but they stirred something in the back of his mind, a memory he couldn't reach. He tried the handle, but it didn't budge, locked tight. He went inside, washed the dirt from his arms, and sat at the kitchen table. The house was quiet but for the hum of the old refrigerator and the ticking of the clock. He couldn't stop thinking about the safe. Why had it been buried? Why would anyone abandon something that solid, that deliberate? He told himself it didn't matter. It was just another piece of scrap, maybe worth something in metal if he could break it down. But he didn't believe his own reasoning. There was something about it that wouldn't let him go. The next day when he walked into town for supplies, the gossip had already spread. He heard the snickers before he even stepped into the store. 2 men at the counter turned as he entered. "Hey, Mercer," one of them said, grinning. "Find your fortune yet? I hear you dragged home half a bank vault." The other slapped his knee. "Hope it's full of gold, or you'll need it to pay for a new back after moving that thing." Laughter filled the room, light and cruel. John only smiled politely and nodded. "Maybe I will," he said, and went about buying flour and oil as though nothing had happened. But their laughter followed him out the door, echoing through the dust. When he got home, he found Ellie sitting on the porch, sketching in a notebook. The safe loomed behind her, rust flakes glittering like tiny embers in the afternoon sun. "They're talking about you in town," she said quietly. "They think you're crazy." "Maybe they're right," he replied with a small smile, kneeling beside her. "But sometimes you have to be crazy to see what others don't." She didn't answer, but he saw the faintest flicker of a smile before she returned to her drawing. He spent the rest of the day cleaning the outer layer of rust from the door. The more he worked, the more he realized how well it had been built. The metal beneath was thick, almost seamless, like something designed not just to keep thieves out, but to defy time itself. He traced the outlines of the old dial, wondering what secrets it once guarded. As evening settled, the sky turned amber and then violet. The safe caught the last rays of sunlight, and for a fleeting second, it seemed to glow as if something inside reflected the light back through the layers of corrosion. John straightened, his breath catching. The glow vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving only the dull, lifeless surface behind. That night, sleep refused to come. He sat by the window listening to the chirping of crickets, his gaze fixed on the shadowed outline of the safe outside. Something about its presence calmed him and unnerved him at once. He remembered how it had felt beneath his hands, warm, alive almost, and wondered if it was just his imagination. The wind picked up, carrying with it the faint scent of rain that never came. At some point, near midnight, he thought he heard a sound, a faint metallic tick, so soft it could have been the shifting of cooling metal or something else entirely. He rose, opened the door, and stepped out into the cool air. The moonlight washed over the safe, highlighting its edges in pale silver. He stood there, waiting, listening. Nothing moved. Only silence stretched around him, deep and endless. Then just as he turned to go back inside, there came another sound, a low, deliberate click from within the safe. It was the unmistakable sound of metal meeting metal, of a mechanism stirring after long sleep. John froze, heart hammering, staring at the unyielding door. The air around him seemed to thicken, heavy with meaning he couldn't yet name. He took a cautious step forward, reached out, and placed his hand on the surface. It felt warm again, pulsing faintly beneath his palm, like the heartbeat of something buried too long. He withdrew his hand slowly, backing away toward the house, his breath quick and shallow. Inside, Ellie stirred in her bed, but did not wake. He looked out the window one last time before pulling the curtain shut. The safe stood silent once more in the moonlight, but John knew, without understanding how, that something inside had changed. It was no longer just a lump of forgotten iron. Something within it had awakened, and whether it was fortune or ruin, he had already set it in motion. By morning, the strange click that had come from the safe felt like something half-imagined. John told himself it was only metal settling in the cool night air, a trick of fatigue, or the echo of a wish. Yet as he stepped outside, he could not help but glance toward the shadowed shape under the lean-to. It sat there perfectly still, but the air around it seemed different somehow, charged as if the iron held more than silence. He ran his hand over its surface again and felt only cold. Whatever he had heard was gone, buried again in rust. He ate a quick breakfast with Ellie before she left for school. The girl tried to hide her unease, but he caught the way her eyes drifted toward the safe each time she passed the window. When she asked softly whether he had dreamed about it, he forced a smile and told her not to worry. "It's just an old box," he said. "Nothing in there but dust." Yet even as he said it, he knew he was lying to both of them. That day he finished his shift early at the junkyard and brought home a few old tools, chisels, wire brushes, a bottle of kerosene. As dust settled, he set to work. The first scrape of the brush against metal filled the air like the sound of a rasping breath. Rust fell away in thin flakes, revealing a darker, more stubborn layer beneath. The smell of iron and kerosene mixed with the dust of the earth until it clung to his clothes and hair. Each hour he worked seemed to draw something out of him, as though the safe were feeding on his persistence. The neighbors noticed. The man who lived across the lane, Hank Doolin, leaned over his fence and called out with a grin, asking if John had found a pirate's chest. Another shouted that maybe the bank would come reclaim its vault once he cracked it open. The laughter rolled through the twilight, sharp and unkind. John said nothing, only straightened his back and kept scrubbing. To respond would have been to admit the laughter mattered. He preferred the rhythm of the brush and the slow unveiling of the metal skin. As the nights went on, he worked longer. He lit a lantern beside him and sometimes forgot the hour entirely, his shadow stretching and shrinking as the flame wavered. Inside the house, Ellie would watch him through the window, her hands folded under her chin. Once she came out and touched his sleeve, whispering that it was late and that people were starting to talk. He nodded but didn't stop. He told her gently to sleep and promised to come in soon, though he rarely did before midnight. By the end of the week, a few letters appeared more clearly where corrosion had been thickest. The words were faint, but under the lantern's light he could make out part of a line. Prototype H1. Beneath it, in smaller print, almost eaten by time, another inscription, Helios Systems, Water Division. The phrase meant nothing to him, yet the idea of water caught his attention, as if the safe itself had chosen the one word that might reach through fatigue and stir hope. On Sunday, his sister Margaret came to visit with her husband. They brought a pie, though the visit was less about kindness than concern. She took one look at the hulking safe and sighed. "John," she said, "you can't let this nonsense take over your life. People are saying you've gone odd in the head. You're raising a child. She needs steadiness, not foolish dreams." He listened quietly, wiping sweat from his neck. "It's not a dream," he said, "just something that feels unfinished." Her husband chuckled. "Looks finished to me. Buried and forgotten for a reason." They left soon after, taking their pity with them. When the sound of their wagon faded, John stood beside the safe, feeling the weight of their judgment settle like dust. He remembered how it had felt under his hand that first night alive, almost breathing. It wasn't madness to want to know why. It was purpose. And a man without purpose was already halfway buried himself. As summer deepened, the laughter grew more public. At the store, voices dropped when he entered. Some of the men there invented stories that he'd found bodies or bombs inside, that he talked to the safe at night. One evening, when he passed the tavern, someone yelled from the porch asking if he'd proposed to his new bride of iron yet. The crowd roared, and John kept walking, jaw clenched. He had learned long ago that ridicule was just fear wearing a smile. Still, Doubt began to creep in. The safe refused every tool he tried. The hinges were fused into a single piece, the dial frozen, the seams welded by corrosion. There were moments when he thought of giving up, selling it for scrap and forgetting the whole thing. But each time he walked away, he found himself turning back. The sight of it in the fading light held him, like a challenge that whispered, "Not yet." One evening, after another day of mockery, he knelt beside it again, determined to see what the laughter had blinded him to. He pried loose a handful of dirt beneath the base and found something metallic wedged in the soil. A small plate, square and dull with grime. When he wiped it clean on his sleeve, letters emerged, sharp and deliberate. Helios prototype. Water purification unit. He stared at it for a long time, trying to piece together what that could mean. Why would anyone hide a water purification device in a safe, and why bury it instead of using it? The question refused to let go. That night clouds gathered, but no rain fell. The air was heavy, promising relief that never came. John sat on the porch, staring at the safe glinting faintly in the lightning flashes. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled. He thought about the name Helios, sun god, if he remembered right. A machine tied to the sun, buried in the dirt, forgotten for decades. It made no sense, yet the contradiction fascinated him. He barely slept. Before dawn, he was outside again, hammer and chisel in hand. Each strike echoed across the still fields. The first few blows bounced off, leaving only sparks. The next ones bit deeper, chipping away rust and revealing the cold gleam of metal beneath. He lost track of time until his shoulders ached and sweat ran into his eyes. Then, just as the sun cleared the hills, something happened. The tip of the chisel struck a hidden groove in the door, and a hollow clang reverberated through the safe, different from all the other dull thuds. He froze. The sound had depth, a resonance that told him the inside wasn't solid. There was space within. He leaned close, pressing his ear to the cool surface. For a moment he thought he heard a faint hum, almost like air moving through a pipe, though that could have been his own heartbeat. He drew back, uncertain whether to be afraid or exhilarated. When Ellie came out later, rubbing her eyes, she found him still staring at the door. He smiled weakly at her and said he thought he was making progress. She nodded, though she didn't understand. As she turned away, he noticed her glance toward the neighbors' houses, where curtains shifted and faces peered out. He realized then how small their world was, how quickly talk traveled through it. Every scrape of his chisel was another note in the music of their gossip. That evening the air felt charged again, as it had the first night. The wind died completely and the crickets fell silent. John set his tools aside and touched the safe with both hands. The metal felt warmer than the air around it. He whispered almost without meaning to, "You've been asleep a long time, haven't you?" The words vanished into the stillness, but the warmth seemed to deepen, pulsing faintly beneath his palms. He stepped back, uneasy yet unable to stop himself from smiling. Perhaps he was a fool, as they all said. But he knew, with the same certainty that had carried him through years of hard living, that this was no ordinary hulk of metal. Something waited inside it, something built with intent, with a purpose lost to memory. As the lantern burned low and the night thickened, he heard it again, that same low, hollow vibration from within, like a heartbeat muffled by distance. The sound was so brief he almost doubted it, yet it left him trembling. He knew what he had heard. The safe was not dead metal. It was responding. He turned off the lantern, letting the darkness swallow everything but the faint outline of the iron box. Behind the closed doors of nearby houses, his neighbors slept soundly, unaware that their laughter was about to turn to disbelief. For the first time since the safe had entered his life, John felt not just curiosity, but destiny. Whatever secret lay trapped behind that sealed door had chosen him to uncover it. And somewhere deep inside the thick iron, something clicked again, soft, deliberate, waiting. The morning after the second strange vibration from the safe, John woke with the certainty that he could not rest until he knew what lay inside it. Sleep had been shallow and broken, haunted by the sound of the metallic heartbeat that seemed to echo through his chest. When the first light of dawn crept through the window, he rose quietly so as not to wake Ellie, pulled on his work clothes and stepped out into the pale air. The yard was still, washed in silver by the early sun, and the safe stood there beneath the lean-to, its rusted sides streaked with dew. It looked inert again, dead and ordinary, yet he felt the same current beneath its surface that had held him captive for days. He set out his tools, his movements slow and deliberate. The neighbors would wake soon, and he didn't want an audience. He worked methodically, chipping away at the edges of the lock, clearing the corrosion that had fused the door to the frame. Each strike rang through the morning, the sound hollow and sharp like a bell calling something buried to attention. Hours passed. Rust turned his hands red. Dust clung to his clothes, but he kept at it. At last he stopped, breathing hard, sweat tracing lines down his temples. A narrow crack had appeared between the door and the body of the safe. It was small, but it was enough to prove that the hinges had finally loosened. He stood back and stared at it, his chest tight. It had taken him nearly 2 weeks to reach this point, and now with the moment so close, fear crept in where excitement should have been. He couldn't explain it. The idea of what lay inside the unknown, sealed and patient, was suddenly enormous. What if it was nothing but dust? Or worse, what if it was something that would remind him how foolish he had been to waste his strength on a dream? The sound of laughter drifted from down the road. Someone was already outside and the voices carried. He heard his name followed by the words crazy and iron coffin. The familiar sting of mockery burned his ears, but this time he smiled faintly. Let them laugh, he thought. They'd have their silence soon enough. When Ellie returned from school that afternoon, she found him sitting beside the safe, turning the cracked handle back and forth. The metal groaned but didn't yield. She put down her bag and came closer. Are you going to open it, Daddy? She asked. Her voice was small, caught between curiosity and fear. Soon, he said. Maybe tonight. She nodded and went inside, though not before casting a long, uneasy look over her shoulder. The safe loomed behind her father like a silent companion, the dying sun painting its edges with copper light. After supper, when darkness gathered and the house fell quiet, John returned to it. He brought a lantern, its weak flame throwing trembling shadows across the yard. The night was hot, the air heavy with the scent of earth and rust. He took up his crowbar and slid its tip into the gap he had carved. For a long moment, he hesitated, feeling the sweat trickle down his neck. Then he braced his feet, drew in a breath, and pushed. The iron protested with a shriek that tore the silence apart. He pushed again, harder. There was a sharp crack, a shudder that ran through the entire frame, and then suddenly the resistance broke. The door swung open with a sound like a sigh released after decades of holding breath. A cloud of red dust rose around him, thick and choking. He stepped back, covering his mouth. The lantern's light flickered across the interior, revealing what lay inside. It was not gold. It was not jewels or paper, or the fortune the valley gossips had joked about. The safe was filled with fragments of metal, twisted pipes, small filters packed with black sand, glass cylinders clouded by time, and, near the back, a bundle of rolled papers bound with a crumbling leather strap. He reached inside and lifted one of the pipes. It was lighter than he expected, lined with holes as if meant to let water pass through. Beneath it lay thin trays layered with charcoal and grit. The smell of ancient machinery hung in the air, dry and mineral, tinged with something that reminded him of rain on dust. For a moment, disappointment crashed through him. After all his effort, after the ridicule, this was what he had uncovered, junk. He dropped to his knees, resting his head against the cold edge of the safe. He stayed that way for a long time, until his breathing steadied and his mind cleared enough to think. Junk maybe, but not random. Everything inside was arranged too deliberately. He picked up one of the papers and carefully unrolled it. The ink had faded, but the lines were precise schematics of some kind, dense with measurements and symbols. Across the top, in bold letters, he could still read, Project Helios, Solar Distillation and Filtration Prototype H1. He felt a strange thrill. The words stirred something in him, a recognition not of knowledge but of meaning. He turned the paper toward the lantern, following the neat diagram of pipes, valves, and filters. A machine built to purify water using sunlight. He thought of the name, Helios, the sun itself, and wondered who had created it and why it had been hidden away here, locked and buried. As he traced the lines with his finger, his mind began to race. He remembered the plate he had found in the soil with the same name, the warmth he'd felt on the safe's surface when the sun hit it just right. Perhaps it had been more than imagination. Perhaps the safe was not a vault at all, but a container for something meant to survive. The idea was wild, but it sent a surge of purpose through him that burned away the sting of mockery. For the next hour he examined each piece with growing fascination. The pipes were thin but durable, the filters layered like sedimentary rock, and the glass vessels still intact despite their age. When he lifted one of the trays, fine grains of black sand slipped through his fingers. Charcoal. He realized that each layer had been meant to strain impurities, guiding liquid downward until it emerged clear. It was ingenious in its simplicity. He set the pieces out on the ground, arranging them as the diagram suggested. His hands moved carefully, reverently, as though assembling a sacred relic. Ellie came to the doorway, drawn by the soft clinking of metal. "Is it treasure?" she asked. "Something better," he said quietly. "A gift from someone who knew what was coming." She frowned, puzzled, but said nothing more. He told her to go inside and sleep, promising that she would understand soon. When she had gone, he knelt again, studying the scattered parts. The machine, whatever it had once been, was incomplete. Some pieces had rotted beyond use. Others were missing entirely, but enough remained to suggest the whole. He imagined sunlight striking the top, water trickling through the filters, clean droplets emerging below. The notion seemed impossible, yet he had seen stranger things in his life. Men surviving droughts by faith alone, crops springing from ground thought dead. Why not this? Before he went to bed, he filled a bucket from the old rain barrel, the water murky and thick with algae. He poured a little through one of the trays lined with sand and charcoal, watching as it seeped slowly through. When it dripped out the bottom, he held the lantern close. The water that emerged was clearer, almost transparent. He touched it with his fingertip and found it smelled like nothing at all, clean, pure. His heart began to pound. He tried it again, adjusting the layers, watching the flow improve. It was crude, unfinished, but it worked. The excitement that surged through him was unlike anything he had felt in years. He stayed outside long after the lantern's flame burned low, rearranging parts, testing flows, sketching his own notes beside the old diagrams. When exhaustion finally claimed him, he left everything where it was and went inside. Ellie was asleep, her small hand clutching the blanket near her face. He paused to look at her, feeling a rare peace settle over him. Maybe, he thought, the safe had found him for a reason. He was nearly asleep when a sound broke the quiet. A faint rustle outside, followed by a metallic scrape. His eyes snapped open. He rose and peered through the curtain. The yard was dark, empty except for the faint glint of the safe and the scattered pieces lying beside it. For a moment he thought the wind had moved something, but then he saw a shadow slip away down the road, small and quick. Someone had been watching him. He went out barefoot, the ground cool under his feet. At the gate he found a scrap of paper wedged between the boards, weighted by a stone. He picked it up, his pulse quickening. In the lantern light, he could just make out the words written in a rough, uneven hand. "Stop digging. It's not yours. Some things should stay buried." He stood there for a long time, the message trembling in his fingers, the night pressing close around him. The laughter of his neighbors had been cruel but harmless. This was something else. Someone knew what he had found, and they didn't want him to uncover more. He looked back toward the safe, its door gaping open like the mouth of a secret that refused to stay quiet. The machine within had already begun to change him, to draw him towards something larger than fear. He folded the note carefully, placed it in his pocket, and whispered to the dark, "You're too late." Then he turned back to the safe, the lantern's light catching his face in a flicker of defiance. He knew now that whatever mystery had slept inside that iron shell was awake, and it had no intention of being buried again. By the time midsummer settled over the valley, the air had grown so dry that even the wind seemed to rasp against the skin. Each dawn rose heavy and brittle, and by noon the earth itself appeared to crack under the weight of the sun. The grass along the hills had turned to pale husks, the river had shrunk to a sluggish thread of brown water, and every well in town sank lower with each passing day. John Mercer woke every morning to the same hollow sound, the creak of the pump that no longer drew, the groan of wood expanding in the heat, the faint cough of dust through the cracks of the windows. The world had stopped breathing. He had tried to ignore the warnings at first. Summers in the valley were always dry, and the old men at the store loved to tell stories about years worse than this one. But by the second month without rain, even those men fell silent. The earth hardened to stone, and the few crops that still grew curled into themselves like dying animals. Families drove their wagons farther and farther to find water that wasn't foul. Children grew pale, their lips cracked from thirst. The smell of sickness drifted from the houses near the river, where people had begun to drink from the stagnant pools that remain. For John, the drought was not just another hardship, it was an answer. While others despaired, he turned his attention once more to the strange device he had unearthed. The note warning him to stop still lay folded in the drawer by his bed, but he refused to be frightened by it. Each night he studied the diagrams he had found inside the safe, tracing their intricate pathways with a trembling finger, and each morning he returned to the yard to refine what he had begun. The parts were fragile, corroded by years underground, but he was patient. He cleaned each pipe, polished each filter, and replaced what could not be saved with pieces scavenged from the junkyard fragments of copper, tin, and glass reshaped to fit the old design. The neighbors still talked, though now their laughter had thinned. They saw him out in the sun, hammering, bending, tightening bolts around a machine they called his rusty altar. Some said he had lost his mind to the heat, that grief and loneliness had driven him to chase phantoms. Yet a few began to watch in silence rather than mockery, their eyes lingering on the strange contraption that took form beside his barn. Perhaps they sensed what he had come to know, that his work was no longer the obsession of a fool, but something vital, something alive. Ellie helped him when she could. The girl had grown quieter as the drought deepened, her cheeks pale and her energy sapped by the constant thirst. Still, she fetched him tools and held parts steady as he worked, her small hands smudged with oil. Sometimes, when she caught him staring at her with worry, she forced a smile and said, "It's going to rain soon." But neither of them truly believed it anymore. One afternoon, the air shimmered with heat so fierce it felt like fire pressed against their backs. John filled a bucket with water from the creek. What little of it remained a thick brown liquid that stank of rot. He carried it to the device that now stood assembled beside the barn. It resembled nothing that had ever been built in the valley before. A tall cylinder of patched metal crowned by a panel of glass in mirrors, pipes twisting down into a series of trays and filters inside the gutted safe. To any outsider, it would have looked like madness, but to John it was a promise. He poured the water into the top opening and stepped back, waiting. At first, nothing happened. The liquid trickled through the filters, sluggish and uncertain. Then, as the sunlight struck the mirrors above, a faint hiss filled the air. The pipes trembled, the metal warmed beneath his fingers, and a thin stream began to flow from the lower spout. It was clear, not entirely pure, but so much cleaner than what had gone in that he could scarcely believe it. He cupped his hands beneath the stream and drank. The taste was sharp, metallic at first, then sweet with the clean edge of life. He turned to Ellie, who watched with wide eyes. "Try it," he said softly. She hesitated, then took a sip. Her face lit up, and she smiled for the first time in weeks. "It's good," she whispered. That night he could not sleep. The thought of what he had accomplished burned in him like a fever. He tested the machine again and again, each time improving the filters, tightening the valves, adjusting the mirrors to catch more light. Soon the water that emerged was as clear as any mountain spring. He filled a cup and set it by Ellie's bed, and when she awoke the next morning, she drank deeply and laughed, a small, joyous sound that cut through the stillness of the house like music. Word began to spread before he could stop it. Someone walking past the farm had seen him pouring water into the strange machine and filling jugs with what came out. By evening, half the valley knew. They gathered near his fence, whispering, At first they were skeptical, remembering how they had mocked him, but desperation erodes pride faster than time. When they saw the glint of water in his hands, the laughter died altogether. A woman asked timidly whether it was real, whether she might taste it. He hesitated, then nodded and filled her cup. She drank, and tears welled in her eyes. "It's clean," she murmured. The crowd thickened over the next days. Farmers, mothers, even children came with pails and jars, staring in awe at the machine that hissed softly in the heat. He gave them water freely, refusing payment despite their offers. "It's not mine," he said simply. "It belongs to all of us." Yet even as gratitude filled their faces, he saw fear behind some of the eyes. Fear of what they didn't understand, of a man they had called mad now standing between them and survival. As the drought worsened, the visits became daily. People lined the road before dawn, their wagons filled with empty barrels. John worked tirelessly to keep the machine running, replacing worn filters, tightening bolts, and cleaning the mirrors when dust choked the light. The sound of trickling water filled the air, a sound more precious than song, but not everyone rejoiced. He noticed the way certain men watched from a distance, men with deep wells on their lands, men who had once profited from the thirst of others. Among them was Virgil Moore, the wealthiest rancher in the valley, whose gaze lingered on the device with a mix of envy and calculation. One evening, as the sun bled red across the fields, Moore rode up to the gate. His horse snorted, kicking at the dust. "That's a fine trick you've got there, Mercer," he said. "Water out of nothing. Must be worth a fortune." "It's not for sale," John replied. Moore smiled thinly. "Everything's for sale. You'll see." Then he turned his horse and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust in his wake. That night John sat beside the machine, the lantern casting long shadows across its gleaming pipes. He could still hear the faint laughter of the rich man echoing in his head, but it no longer unsettled him. The machine hummed softly, steady and alive. He reached out and rested his hand against the warm metal, feeling the pulse of its work. It reminded him of the first night he had found the safe, of the heartbeat he thought he had imagined. Now he understood it had been waiting for this, for him. The next day the heat grew worse. The air shimmered over the parched fields and the sky turned the color of bone. The people who came to his farm were silent now, too weak to speak as they waited for their turn to drink. The machine worked tirelessly, yet even its rhythm began to falter under the demand. John replaced filters until his fingers bled, pouring the last of his strength into keeping it alive. Late that night, as he sat with Ellie watching the stars flicker in the suffocating sky, a sound drifted from the road, a murmur like wind over dry grass. He rose and walked to the gate. What he saw there made him stop cold. A long line of people stretched into the darkness, their faces hollow, their eyes gleaming with the same desperate hope. They carried buckets, jugs, anything that could hold water. The murmuring stopped when they saw him. Dozens of voices rose together, not in laughter this time, but in pleading. "Please, Mercer," someone called. "Help us." He nodded, though his throat was tight. "I will," he said, "as long as there's water to give." Behind him the machine gave a low hum, almost a sigh, as if acknowledging his promise. The lantern flame flickered, and the heat of the day hung heavy even in the night. He knew that this was no longer just his burden or his redemption. It was the valley's last chance. As he turned back toward the machine, the first faint crackle of thunder rolled over the distant hills, too far to promise rain, but near enough to stir the air. He looked up at the horizon, where the stars shimmered through a haze of dust. The drought was not over, and neither was the fight that had begun. The people outside the gate waited, silent and still, their eyes fixed on the glow of the lantern beside the barn. And as John began to fill the first cup, the iron safe that had once been the object of laughter gleamed faintly in the darkness, as though something inside it had awakened again, listening. The storm had not yet come, but he could feel it moving, closer with every breath. When dawn came, it arrived not with coolness, but with a dull, suffocating heat that rolled across the fields like breath from a furnace. The drought had lasted so long that no one could remember when the last true rain had fallen. The town's riverbed was now a gash of cracked mud, and the air carried a faint, metallic taste of despair. But beyond the ridge, at the edge of that dying land, a single place still breathed: the Mercer farm. From before sunrise, people gathered there again, carrying empty cans and jugs, forming a slow-moving line that stretched along the dusty road. They no longer laughed or whispered among themselves. There was reverence now, even fear, in the way they approached the strange device that hissed and shimmered under the morning light. John stood beside it, his face weathered and streaked with dirt, his hands raw from work. The machine, patched and imperfect as it was, still functioned. Water dripped from its spout into waiting vessels with a steady rhythm that sounded almost like life itself. Ellie helped him, handing out cups, her small arms trembling under the weight of the jugs they filled. Neither spoke much. Words seemed unnecessary in the presence of that miracle. Each person who drank bowed their heads slightly before turning away, as if afraid to break some sacred silence. For days, the Mercer place had become the heart of the valley. It drew the desperate, the sick, the hopeless. Even those who had once scorned John now came with lowered eyes, murmuring thanks they could barely bring themselves to say aloud. He accepted none of their offerings, refusing the coins and food they tried to leave. "Keep them," he told everyone the same way. "This isn't mine. It belongs to whoever's thirsty." His voice carried the calm of a man who had made peace with something greater than himself. But not everyone came with gratitude. The men who had watched from afar, landowners, traders, those whose wealth had depended on scarcity, were no longer content to observe. They came one evening as the line was thinning, led by Virgil Moore on his bay horse, his fine shirt spotless despite the choking dust. Behind him trailed 3 others, men who once sold water from their wells at prices that had bled the valley dry. "Mercer," Moore called as he dismounted, his tone smooth but edged. "You've done something remarkable. I'll give you that. Words spread beyond this valley. People are talking about a man who pulls water out of sunlight and scrap metal. You could be a rich man if you wanted." John kept working, pouring more dirty water into the upper chamber. The machine hissed in answer. "I'm not interested in riches," he said without looking up. Moore smiled thinly. "You will be. The world runs on trade, not charity. That thing of yours could fill tankers, water whole counties. But to do that, you'll need capital. Partners." His gaze flicked toward the waiting crowd. "And protection. Something like this, well, some people might want to take it from you." At that, John straightened and finally met his eyes. "You already tried to take it once," he said quietly, "when you owned every well in this valley." Moore's smile didn't falter, but the edges of it hardened. "Think about what you're doing," he said, mounting again. "The minute you can't feed this crowd, they'll turn on you. They always do. And when they do, you'll wish you had friends with deeper pockets." He tipped his hat, turned his horse, and rode away into the haze. That night the wind returned, restless and hot. It carried dust through every crack of the house and rattled the loose boards of the barn. John sat by the machine long after everyone had gone, watching the moonlight glint across its metal skin. Ellie slept nearby, curled up on an old blanket, the sound of dripping water like a lullaby. For a moment, he thought of Moore's warning. It was true. If the machine failed, if the filters clogged or the mirrors cracked, the people who now called him savior might one day call him thief. But he pushed the thought aside. He would keep it running. He had to. As the night deepened, he began to hear something new, a faint tremor beneath the earth, distant but growing. He stood and looked toward the horizon. Far to the west, a flicker of light broke the darkness, followed by another. Then came the sound, low, rolling, alive. Thunder. He woke Ellie and led her outside. The horizon pulsed again, white fire weaving through clouds that had not gathered there in months. The air changed. He could feel it, smell it, the promise of rain carried on the wind. Around them, the waiting jars and barrels glimmered under the lightning. He felt his heart lift for the first time in years. Maybe at last the land would breathe again. By morning, the sky was veiled in heavy gray, and the first drops began to fall. Sparse at first, hesitant, then faster, heavier, until the ground itself seemed to sigh in relief. People shouted from the road, laughing and crying all at once. The drought had broken. John stood in the downpour, his face turned upward, the rain washing away the dust, the exhaustion, the doubt. But even as he rejoiced, the machine still ran beside him, drawing in water, purifying it, humming softly beneath the storm. He realized then that it no longer needed to. Its purpose had been fulfilled, yet it kept working, as if unwilling to stop, as if it had become a living part of the world it had saved. When the rain slowed to a steady rhythm, the people began to leave, their barrels full, their faces transformed by gratitude. Some hugged him, others simply touched his arm in silence. No one spoke of payment anymore. When the last wagon rolled away and the road grew quiet, John returned to the safe. It sat gleaming under the gray sky, its rust washed clean, its iron bright again for the first time in decades. He ran his hand over its surface, feeling warmth even in the cool rain. The heartbeat he had sensed so long ago still pulsed faintly beneath his palm. Ellie came to stand beside him, water dripping from her hair. She looked up at him and smiled. "It worked," she said. "You did it." He shook his head gently. "No," he replied. "It did." They stood together in silence, father and daughter, watching as the rain fell harder, filling the fields that had been barren for so long. In the distance, the river began to murmur again. The land was coming back to life. That night, after Ellie had fallen asleep, John sat once more beside the machine. The storm had passed and the moon emerged through scattered clouds. The machine was quiet now, its work complete. He placed his hand on the old door of the safe one last time. "You've done enough," he whispered. As if in answer, the metal gave a soft hum, a single tone that lingered in the air before fading into silence. He stayed there until the moon reached its highest point, the world around him finally at peace. When he rose and looked toward the horizon, he saw the faintest glimmer of dawn breaking beyond the hills. The light touched the wet fields, turning them silver, and reflected off the safe surface until it shone like something newborn. The neighbors would wake soon and see the green beginning to rise from the soil, the first shoots piercing through the mud. They would remember the drought, the thirst, the man they had mocked, and the strange machine that had given them hope. John walked back toward the house, his boots sinking into the soft, renewed earth. Behind him, the safe stood quietly, gleaming in the morning light as if guarding the secret of life itself. The wind carried the scent of rain and metal, and something purer, still a reminder that sometimes salvation comes not from power or wealth, but from the stubborn faith of a man who refuses to stop believing. As the first birds began to sing, John paused at the door and looked once more at the safe, the water, the land. He smiled faintly. Whatever force had guided his hands, whatever mystery had slept within that iron shell, had done what it came to do. The valley would live again. And as he turned inside to wake Ellie to the sound of a world reborn, a final drop of water fell from the mouth of the machine, striking the ground below. It shone briefly in the light of dawn, then vanished into the earth, leaving behind nothing but silence and life. If this story moved you, don't stop here. Hit subscribe and turn on the bell so you never miss the next unbelievable twist. There are more stories waiting for you, each one more shocking, more powerful, and more unforgettable. Share this video with your friends and family and let them experience it too. The next story might just change how you see everything.